William Howard Taft was born on September 15, 1857, the son of Alphonso Taft and Louise. Alphonso Taft later served as U.S. War Secretary and Attorney General under Ulysses S. Grant, and afterward became U.S. Minister to Austria-Hungary under Chester A. Arthur. He also served as Minister to Russia before finishing his service during the presidency of Grover Cleveland. Taft's parents strongly pushed him to perform well in school, and he was known more for hard work than natural brilliance. He studied at Woodward High School in his hometown of Cincinnati and later attended Yale University, where he became a heavyweight wrestling champion and was well liked by his classmates. Taft graduated second in his class in 1878 and earned a law degree 2 years later from Cincinnati Law School. By studying law in his father's office and working for the Cincinnati commercial newspaper, he gained practical legal experience not taught in classrooms. Taft is often considered part of one of the earliest modern political dynasties. In a biography written by Jeffrey Rosen, it is stated that Taft inherited his judicial mindset and constitutional thinking from his father. Rosen also pointed out that Taft was born the year after the 1856 Republican National Convention, where Alphonso Taft served as a delegate. Taft was not his parents' first son, as their first child died from whooping cough, which caused his mother to become determined to protect the life of her next son. Before Taft's birth, his father had purchased a large Greek revival house in Cincinnati with 8 bedrooms and servant quarters. Taft was born and raised there and later returned after college. The home contained a large library filled with law books that he and his father studied together, often discussing law and the Constitution. Taft was also extremely sensitive to criticism of his father. In one case, when a newspaper editor criticized Alphonso, Taft confronted him physically in anger. These bursts of anger appeared again during his career when he reacted strongly to those he saw as disloyal. Alphonso shared some of this sensitivity, but his extremely high expectations and lack of praise created lifelong anxiety in Taft, which he often expressed in letters to family. Taft left his job as assistant prosecutor for Hamilton County in January 1882 after being appointed collector of internal revenue for Ohio's 1st District. During Arthur's political era, Taft supported James G. Blaine in his failed 1884 presidential campaign against Cleveland. 3 years later, Ohio Governor Joseph B. Foraker appointed Taft to fill an opening on the Cincinnati Supreme Court. After 1 year, Taft faced the only election he ever ran in besides his presidential campaigns, and he won a 5-year term. Around this time, he met Helen Herron, who later agreed to marry him after initially declining. Their wedding took place on June 19, 1886, beginning a 44-year marriage that produced 3 children, including future U.S. Senator Robert A. Taft. In 1889, Taft attempted to gain appointment to the Supreme Court from Benjamin Harrison, but was instead chosen to serve as U.S. Solicitor General. The following year, Taft won 15 of the 18 Supreme Court cases he argued and was later appointed to the newly created 6th Circuit Court. He hoped this lifetime judicial appointment would eventually help him reach the Supreme Court. While his brother Charles helped support him financially, Taft traveled through Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, and Tennessee hearing cases. He also worked with Circuit Justice John Marshall Harlan and other judges. From 1892 to 1900, Taft experienced one of the happiest periods of his life both personally and professionally. On the bench, he supported labor rights but also ruled against workers in negligence cases. His biographer Henry Pringle later credited him with helping revive the Sherman Antitrust Act through his decision in the Addiston Pipe and Steel Company case, ruling that a pipe manufacturers association had violated antitrust law. In 1896, Taft became dean and property law professor at Cincinnati Law School, where he introduced the case method of teaching. Because he was a federal judge, he could not actively participate in politics, but he remained loyal to the Republican Party. He was surprised when William McKinley became the leading Republican candidate in the 1896 election, but he still supported him mainly because he strongly opposed Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan, whom he considered radical for supporting free silver. In January 1900, near the end of McKinley's first term, Taft was called to Washington and was appointed to lead a commission that would establish civilian government in the Philippines. McKinley promised to appoint Taft to the Supreme Court when a vacancy opened if he accepted the role. At that time, military Governor General Arthur MacArthur Jr. commanded American forces there and viewed the commission as unnecessary interference, but he cooperated because the commission controlled the military budget. Taft became civilian governor in 1901 and tried to treat Filipinos equally while preparing them for self-government, avoiding racial segregation at official events. In September 1901, McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo, New York, and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt and Taft had been friends for about 10 years, first becoming close in 1890 when Taft served as Solicitor General. In 1902, Taft was considered for a Supreme Court vacancy left by George Shiras Jr., but declined because he believed he still had important work in the Philippines. However, he later accepted Roosevelt's offer to become Secretary of War. During this period, Taft grew confident that he might become the next Republican presidential nominee. He also declined another Supreme Court opportunity after Henry Billings Brown resigned, because he still hoped to become Chief Justice one day. He closely followed the health of Chief Justice Melville Fuller, who remained in office throughout Roosevelt's presidency, while the United States had secured rights to build a canal across Isthmus of Panama. The commission responsible for this project struggled to keep a head engineer until George W. Goethals assumed control at Taft's request. On the night of Roosevelt's victory in a 19-4 presidential election, he promised he would not pursue another term, a decision he would later regret while honoring it. Staying true to his word and considering Taft his ideal successor, several Republicans thought about running but ultimately chose not to. President Roosevelt then issued a special message to Congress criticizing corporate corruption, while Charles Evans pursued presidential ambitions. Taft secured the nomination at the 1908 Republican National Convention, and New York Representative James S. Sherman was selected as his running mate. In the general election, Taft faced William Jennings Bryan, who had previously been nominated twice by the Democratic Party and claimed he was the true continuation of Roosevelt's vision since many reform ideas originally came from Bryan. Taft agreed with most of Roosevelt's policies but believed the executive powers used by Roosevelt should rest on firmer legal foundations. Taft appointed Assistant Postmaster General Frank H. Hitchcock as chairman of the RNC, which upset progressives, and Roosevelt frequently advised him, fearing Bryan might win. Although Taft earned only 51% of the popular vote, he secured 321 electoral votes compared to Bryan's 162. Interaction between Roosevelt and Taft noticeably declined during the 4 months between the election and inauguration. Taft's inauguration occurred in the Senate chamber rather than outdoors at the Capitol because Washington was covered in ice. Unlike Roosevelt, Taft struggled to maintain an easy relationship with the press. He prioritized restructuring the State Department and introduced geographic divisions for the first time, including regions such as the Far East, Latin America, and Western Europe. Taft and Secretary of State Philander C. Knox maintained a strong partnership despite Knox's strained relationship with the Senate. In diplomatic meetings, Taft and Knox agreed that the United States should avoid interfering in European affairs but supported using force to enforce the Monroe Doctrine in the Americas. Taft's December 1910 annual message promoted a free trade agreement with Canada. Many Canadians opposed the proposal, fearing the United States might abandon it like the earlier Elgin-Marcy Treaty. While Congress passed the agreement, Canada's Parliament became deadlocked and later replaced Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier following an election. Ultimately, no final agreement was reached, and the dispute deepened divisions within the Republican Party. The proposed Canadian trade agreement had support from both Canadian and British governments. The Elgin-Marcy Treaty, made during Pierce's presidency, demonstrated the long history of cooperation attempts between the United States and Canada as neighboring democracies. This tradition of cooperation can also be seen in modern agreements such as the USMCA. The concept of trade partnership with Canada stretches back to Pierce's era more than a century ago. Taft expanded Roosevelt's trust-busting efforts, launching 70 antitrust cases in 4 years compared to Roosevelt's 47. United States Steel faced investigation by the House of Representatives, and the Justice Department filed suit demanding the company grant corporate independence to its subsidiaries. The legal filings, which Taft had not reviewed beforehand, suggested Roosevelt had previously supported monopolies and had been misled by industrialists. Roosevelt felt offended but did not blame Taft, even though Taft claimed he had not seen the documents beforehand. Taft was less focused on conservation than Roosevelt. His decision to replace James Garfield with Richard Ballinger as Secretary of the Interior convinced Roosevelt that Taft would follow a different policy direction. Businessman Clarence Cunningham discovered coal deposits in Alaska in 1909. These claims were examined by Land Office agent Louis Glavis, who broke protocol by asking U.S. Forest Service Chief Gifford Pinchot for help instead of contacting the Interior Department. Glavis publicly accused Ballinger of previously acting as Cunningham's attorney, which would have violated conflict of interest laws. This controversy became known as the Ballinger-Pinchot affair and caused a split between progressives and Roosevelt supporters. Taft's Southern policy included his decision, announced during his inaugural address, not to appoint Black Americans to federal positions. This created tension and contrasted with Roosevelt's policy of keeping Black Americans in federal jobs. According to biographer Coletta, Taft's reluctance to strongly support black equality in order to appease white citizens contributed to Black Americans shifting political support toward the Democratic Party. The presidency is generally expected to provide leadership regardless of party affiliation. Critics saw Taft's Southern policy as weak because it appeared to avoid defending minority rights during a time when federal protection was still necessary. Rather than strongly supporting Black Americans as Roosevelt had, Taft tried to satisfy both sides, which ultimately failed. This made him appear weak, slowed racial progress, and pushed African Americans toward the Democratic Party because they had few political alternatives at the time. During his presidency, Taft made 6 Supreme Court appointments, the third highest number among U.S. presidents. He appointed 65-year-old former Confederate soldier and Democrat Horace Lurton after the death of Rufus Peckham, making Lurton the oldest Supreme Court appointee at the time. 5 months later, Taft selected New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes following Justice David Brewer's death and suggested Hughes could become Chief Justice if the position opened. When Chief Justice Fuller died 4 months later, Taft appointed Edward Douglas White. Some believe Taft selected White partly because Lurton was older and less likely to outlive him, potentially allowing Taft himself to become Chief Justice later. Appeals Court Judge Willis Van Devontaire was chosen to replace White. Taft filled another vacancy in December 1910 after William Henry Moody retired, appointing his golfing companion Joseph R. Lamar. When Justice Harlan died the following October, Taft chose New Jersey Chancellor Mahlon Pitney, who became the last Supreme Court justice appointed without attending law school and had a stronger anti-labor stance than Taft's other appointees, leading to Senate opposition. Taft also appointed 13 judges to the federal courts of appeals and 38 to U.S. district courts. His presidency also created the Commerce Court, which later faced criticism after Judge Robert W. Archibald was impeached in 1912 for corruption. Only 2 presidents made more Supreme Court appointments than Taft, Washington and Franklin D. Roosevelt. On average, 1 or 2 Supreme Court seats became vacant each year during Taft's presidency due to retirement or death. Taft's presidency also included the admission of New Mexico and Arizona as states in 1912, less than 2 months apart, as he prepared to campaign for re-election. Supporters of Roosevelt wrote to him, encouraging the former president to seek another term. Roosevelt stated that he would accept the Republican nomination if it were offered. He secured a majority of delegates during the primary, yet Taft was ultimately renominated. Shortly before the election, Vice President Sherman died and was replaced by Columbia University President Nicholas Butler. Many Roosevelt supporters believed the nomination had been taken from him unfairly, so they joined with him to create the Progressive Party. During the general election, Taft delivered only one speech and struggled to raise campaign funds because many donors chose to support Democratic nominee Woodrow Wilson. The Taft-Butler ticket earned 8 electoral votes from Vermont and Utah, while Roosevelt received 88 and Wilson 435. It is also important to note that Roosevelt secured 278 of the 362 delegates at the Republican National Convention. When Roosevelt and his supporters later argued that they had been cheated and decided to establish their own party, their claims seemed largely justified. This situation was different from a modern example like the 2016 Democratic primary, where Sanders had many supporters who believed the process was unfair due to media coverage that heavily favored his opponents. While multiple factors were involved, it was never disputed that Clinton received more votes than Sanders, even if concerns existed about superdelegates. Roosevelt, however, had more delegates, and many people viewed the Republican National Committee as corrupt because of its strong determination to keep Taft as the nominee regardless of delegate results. In effect, they ignored public support for the popular former president and pushed forward with their own decision, which ultimately hurt them in November. Taft experienced an active and notable post-presidency. Within months of leaving office, he became president of the American Bar Association and used the role to remove opponents from committees. He also served as president of the League to Enforce Peace, an organization focused on preventing wars through international cooperation among nations. Wilson later addressed the League, speaking about forming an organization that could stop a Second World War. During the 1916 election, attempts were made to encourage Taft and Roosevelt to reconcile, but these efforts failed. The following year, Taft tried to join a Connecticut State Guard. In August, Wilson appointed him Major General of the Red Cross, and Taft took leave from Yale to serve as co-chairman of the National War Labor Board. In the months leading up to Roosevelt's death in January 1919, the two men showed public friendliness. After Roosevelt died, Taft wrote that if Roosevelt had died while still hostile toward him, he would have regretted it for life, adding that he had always loved him and would always cherish his memory. In the 1920 election, Republicans regained the presidency with Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. 2 months into Harding's term, Chief Justice White died. Taft quietly worked behind the scenes to be considered as his successor, coordinating with members of Harding's advisory group known as the Ohio Gang. Attorney General Harry Daugherty supported Taft's candidacy, and Harding nominated him for the vacancy on June 30th. Taft was confirmed by a bipartisan Senate vote of 61-4, becoming the first and only person to serve both as president and as a Supreme Court justice. The 4 senators who opposed his confirmation were Republicans Hiram Johnson, William Borah, and Robert M. La Follette, along with Democrat Thomas C. Watson. The Taft Court developed a conservative reputation regarding Commerce Clause rulings, making it harder for the federal government to regulate industry. Judicial appointments made by Coolidge and Hoover lowered Taft's opinion of both presidents. Between 1921 and 1928, 84% of Taft court decisions were unanimous, and Taft either wrote or joined the majority opinion in 98.7% of cases. Later in his tenure, due partly to declining health and less pressure to present a unified front, the unanimous decision rate dropped to 70% by 1929. Smithsonian writer Eric Trickey noted that as Chief Justice, Taft expanded federal authority more than he had during his cautious presidency. As president, Taft preferred a limited interpretation of executive power and often avoided acting unless clearly authorized by law or the Constitution. However, his most important and lasting judicial opinion came in Myers v. United States, where he supported presidential authority to remove federal officials without Senate approval. Although Taft frequently supported limits on government regulation of corporations, there were exceptions. He supported an Oregon law establishing a 10-hour maximum workday for women and dissented in a case that struck down minimum wage protections for female workers. Observers also noted that Taft lobbied Congress to help improve federal court administration. This effort led to the creation of the Judicial Conference in 1922 and helped secure passage of the Judiciary Act of 1925, which gave Congress more discretion in choosing constitutional cases rather than forcing it to hear less important mandatory disputes. Taft also helped end the practice of Supreme Court justices meeting in the Senate chamber by pushing for a dedicated building. The new building, often called the Temple of Justice, was designed by Cass Gilbert and was described as the clearest physical symbol of Taft's constitutional vision for the court. His tenure as Chief Justice was highly respected. A 1983 survey of judicial historians ranked him 5th among 16 Chief Justices, behind several highly influential figures. During this period, Taft's health slowly worsened. He also worried about retiring while Hoover was president because Hoover tended to appoint progressive judges. Taft was especially concerned about Associate Justice Harlan F. Stone, who eventually replaced him and later became Chief Justice after being nominated in 1941, serving until 1946. By late January 1930, Taft could barely speak and began experiencing hallucinations. He resigned only after Hoover assured him that Charles Evan Hughes would be nominated as Chief Justice. Taft died at home on March 8, becoming the first U.S. President and Supreme Court Justice buried in Arlington National Cemetery. In summary, one of Taft's most significant legacies was shaping the Supreme Court more than most presidents. His political career also indirectly contributed to one of the largest third-party voting outcomes in American history. He supported ideas like closer Canada-U.S. trade cooperation, concepts that continue in modern agreements, though they are rarely linked directly to him. The admission of 2 states during his presidency also formed part of his legacy. If Taft had not lived in the shadow of Roosevelt, his historical reputation might be much higher. Nevertheless, he remains the only president to later become Chief Justice, making his post-presidency one of the most impactful in American history. He spent decades hoping to serve on the Supreme Court and ultimately achieved that goal. He will always be remembered as the president who later became Chief Justice. Even if another president were ever appointed to the court, Taft would still be remembered as the first, marking his life as both remarkable and historically significant.